Right now, while you're watching this, the ground has been moving in more places than most people realize. Venezuela is still counting bodies from an earthquake that struck over 2 weeks ago. Japan spent April watching a tsunami warning play out along a coastline that's already buried tens of thousands of people once before. And this June, a team of scientists quietly published a finding about California that should be a much bigger story than it currently is. The San Andreas fault system has reached its highest stress level in 1,000 years. 3. Continents. 3 completely different outcomes. And one uncomfortable question underneath all of it: is the ground actually more dangerous right now, or have we simply built ourselves into more danger than the ground ever changed? Let's go through what actually happened, because the sequence matters as much as the numbers. On June 24th, 2 enormous earthquakes struck northwestern Venezuela within 39 seconds of each other. 39 seconds. Not enough time to process the first one before the second arrived. The first measured magnitude 7.2. The second, the main shock, came in at 7.5. The most powerful earthquake to hit the country in more than a century. Both were centered near the town of Moran in Yaracuy State. And both were strike-slip ruptures, meaning the ground on either side of the fault tore sideways past itself rather than lifting or dropping. Here's why the depth matters more than the magnitude number alone. These ruptures sat only around 10 kilometers below the surface. When an earthquake happens, that shallow, almost none of its energy gets absorbed by the rock between the fault and the surface. It arrives essentially undiluted. Caracas endured close to a minute of violent shaking. In La Guaira, the coastal state sitting almost directly above the rupture zone, roughly 80% of buildings collapsed. Streets vanished under debris. The international airport was damaged. Power failed across large areas, and mobile networks went down with it, which meant families couldn't reach each other and rescue crews couldn't coordinate in the hours that mattered most. The scale of what followed has been almost impossible to fully absorb. In the earthquake's first hours, Venezuelan officials reported a death toll in the dozens. Within 2 days, that number had passed 1,000. By the following week, it had passed 3,000. As of the most recent figures, the confirmed death toll stands at 3,189, with more than 16,700 people injured, and tens of thousands still listed as missing or unaccounted for. The United Nations has said the true number of missing may run into the tens of thousands. A 10-day critical rescue window has already closed, though rescuers have continued pulling survivors from collapsed buildings well past that point, including one man freed after more than 100 hours trapped beneath rubble. And there's a second disaster layered underneath the first one. Venezuela was already in the middle of a severe economic and political crisis before the ground ever moved. Years of deferred infrastructure maintenance meant that hundreds of thousands of people were living in structures that were never reinforced to withstand serious shaking. A healthcare system already stretched thin by years of underfunding now had to absorb thousands of injured people in a matter of days, with officials reporting more than a dozen damaged hospitals, roughly 30,000 Venezuelan emergency workers and close to 3,000 foreign rescue personnel from more than 20 countries have been working the disaster zone, some of them using search dogs, others resorting to hand tools because heavy machinery couldn't reach the hardest-hit neighborhoods. Whole families abroad have spent the last 2 weeks searching. Social media for any sign of relatives buried in specific collapsed buildings, sometimes learning only that a crane would be needed before any search could even begin. This is what a magnitude 7.5 earthquake does to a country that wasn't built to survive it. And this is exactly why the next part of this story matters so much. Because less than a month earlier, on the other side of the planet, a nearly identical earthquake produced an almost unbelievably different result. On April 20th, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off Japan's Sanriku coast, in the same general stretch of ocean that produced the catastrophic 2011 Tohoku disaster. Japan's own meteorological agency briefly measured it even higher at 7.7 before settling on the final figure. The shaking was felt from Hokkaido in the north down through central Japan, meaning tens of millions of people experienced this earthquake directly. A tsunami warning went out immediately, evacuation orders reached tens of thousands of residents, and waves as high as 3 feet were recorded along the coast. Modest compared to the 10-foot waves officials had initially warned were possible, but still an active tsunami event playing out in real time on national television. The final outcome? A handful of power outages, 2 minor injuries from falls, and 0 deaths. 0 collapsed buildings. Read that back next to Venezuela. A 7.4 earthquake and an active tsunami warning across a country of 125 million people. 2 injuries. Nobody killed. That is not a story about luck. Japan sits atop some of the most aggressive seismic engineering standards on the planet. Buildings designed to flex under shaking rather than resist it outright. Bullet trains equipped with sensors that trigger automatic braking. The instant unusual ground motion is detected. And a population that has been drilling earthquake response since elementary school. For generations. In the days after the April quake, Japanese authorities issued what's called a megaquake advisory, a formal statement that the short-term probability of a magnitude 8 or larger earthquake had risen roughly tenfold above its normal background level, and asked residents across more than 180 coastal towns to quietly confirm their evacuation routes. Not panic, practiced routine. Japan sits where 4 tectonic plates meet, and it experiences somewhere around 1,500 felt earthquakes every year. This isn't a country that occasionally has earthquakes. It's a country that has structured its entire built environment around the certainty that the ground will keep moving, indefinitely, forever. 15 years after Tohoku killed close to 22,000 people along that same coastline, a comparable-sized earthquake this spring killed effectively no one. That gap between those two outcomes is the single clearest lesson in this entire story, and it has nothing to do with the earthquakes themselves. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the science published this past month suggests the next test case for that lesson may be sitting directly beneath one of the largest metropolitan regions in the United States. In June, a research team led by geophysicist Lillian Burkhardt, working with colleagues including USGS seismologist Kate Scherer, published a study in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Solid Earth focused on the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems in Southern California. Their conclusion: stress along these fault segments has now reached its highest level in 1,000 years of geological record. Here's what that actually means in practice. Tectonic plates never stop moving. Along a locked fault, friction holds the surface in place even as the deeper crust keeps sliding, which means the strain doesn't release. It accumulates silently, year after year, decade after decade, stored as elastic tension in the surrounding rock. The longer that stretch of fault goes without a major rupture, the more energy piles up, and the larger the eventual earthquake tends to be when the fault finally gives way. The southern San Andreas last ruptured significantly in 1857 in the 40 Tejon earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.9. That was close to 170 years ago. For all that time, the Pacific and North American plates have kept grinding past each other along this fault at roughly 5 centimeters a year, with nowhere for that motion to go except into stored stress. To measure this, Burkhardt's team built a physics-based model simulating 1,000 years of earthquake history along both fault systems, feeding it radiocarbon-dated sediment records and centuries of documented ground ruptures, then running the simulation forward to today. The result? Stress on multiple segments isn't approaching some critical threshold. According to the model, it has already passed it. The study surfaced a second finding that makes the picture even more complicated. Roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems meet at a junction called Cajun Pass, which the researchers describe as functioning like an earthquake gate. Under the right stress conditions, a rupture starting on one fault can jump through that junction onto the other, turning what would have been a single fault earthquake into a combined rupture across both systems, potentially in the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range, threatening the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley, simultaneously, rather than one corridor at a time. Scherer has been careful to note that this doesn't mean Southern California residents should be dramatically more alarmed than they already were. The region has known this earthquake was overdue for decades. What's changed is the precision of the warning, not the fundamental risk itself. Still, when asked how soon a major rupture might occur, one of the study's collaborators put the honest answer plainly. On a geological timescale, there's effectively no meaningful difference between it happening tomorrow and it happening in 30 years. Consider what that would actually mean on the ground. Los Angeles County alone holds more than 10 million people. Thousands of older soft-story apartment buildings from the 1960s and 70s are known to be especially vulnerable to this kind of shaking. Gas mains, water lines, and freeway corridors all cross active fault traces throughout the region. A joint rupture across both fault systems could plausibly trigger fires from broken gas lines, water main failures, undermining firefighting efforts at the exact moment they're needed most, and hospitals absorbing casualties while some of their own infrastructure is compromised. California has made real investments here. The Shake Alert early warning system, now active statewide, gives residents anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds of notice before major shaking arrives by detecting the faster, weaker waves that travel ahead of the destructive ones. That's enough time to drop under a desk, for a surgeon to pause a procedure, for a train to begin braking before a bridge. But retrofitting the state's older, more vulnerable buildings has moved, much slower than the science justifying it. And there's still a meaningful gap between what researchers now understand about this risk and what the general public has absorbed. So, is the planet doing something unusual right now? Venezuela, Japan, California under a fresh 1,000-year stress reading. Add in a magnitude 6.5 earthquake that struck the Philippines this year, tremors across Papua New Guinea, and a 5.2 in Nicaragua, and it's a reasonable instinct to look for a connection tying it all together. The honest answer is that these systems aren't connected. Venezuela sits along the boundary between the Caribbean and South American plates, an entirely separate transform fault system running along the northern edge of the continent. Japan sits atop a subduction zone where the Pacific plate dives beneath the region around it. These fault systems don't communicate with each other in any meaningful geophysical sense. The Venezuela earthquakes didn't trigger the Japan earthquake, and neither has any bearing on California's accumulated stress. The planet produces something like 120 to 140 magnitude 6 or larger earthquakes every year, roughly one every 3 days somewhere on Earth. A cluster of significant earthquakes appearing in the same stretch of weeks is statistically ordinary, not a yield sign that the Earth's crust has somehow become more active than usual. It's closer to what you'd expect from a planet this geologically busy on any given month, in any given year, whether or not the news cycle happens to be paying attention to it. What has genuinely changed isn't the geology. It's how many people now live directly in its path, and in what kind of buildings. Tokyo, Manila, Jakarta, Los Angeles, Istanbul, Mexico City, global cities that have grown enormously over the last 70 years, many of them sitting squarely along active fault systems, all part of the roughly 40,000 kilometer arc known as the Pacific Ring of Fire, which alone accounts for around 90% of the planet's earthquakes. The question that actually matters isn't whether these places will eventually be struck. Geologically, that's close to guaranteed. The question is what condition their buildings, infrastructure, and emergency response systems will be in on the day it happens. Istanbul offers a preview of exactly this kind of waiting game. The North Anatolian Fault runs roughly 20 kilometers south of the city, and its ruptures over the past century have marched steadily westward with unusual, almost mechanical consistency, a pattern researchers have used to estimate where the next major break is likely to occur. The segment directly beneath the Sea of Marmara, just off Istanbul's coast, hasn't ruptured since 1766. Researchers at Germany's GFZ Center have estimated that stretch alone needs to release nearly 5 meters of accumulated displacement whenever it finally slips. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake in that same sea in 2025 sent hundreds of people to hospitals and triggered panic through the night without causing a single death, a warning shot rather than the main event. Current estimates put the odds of a major rupture beneath Istanbul sometime in the next 3 decades at close to 50%. In a city of 16 million people, carrying much of the same older, inconsistently reinforced building stock that made Venezuela's disaster so much worse than the raw magnitude alone would suggest. The economic toll layered on top of the human one is staggering in its own right. United Nations assessments have placed direct losses from the Venezuela earthquakes somewhere in the range of several $billion, with broader estimates of total damage, including destroyed housing, schools, and infrastructure, running into the tens of billions, a meaningful share of the country's entire economy erased in under a minute of shaking. More than 1 million people are now estimated to need humanitarian assistance because of this disaster alone, layered onto a population that was already struggling before the ground moved. It's worth understanding, too, why a jump from magnitude 7 to magnitude 8 sounds so much more frightening to scientists than the numbers alone imply. The scale is logarithmic. Each whole step upward represents roughly 10 times more ground motion and somewhere around 31 times more released energy. A magnitude 7 earthquake releases energy comparable to hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT detonating at once. A magnitude 8 releases roughly 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. That's why a seemingly small difference between Japan's 7.4 and Venezuela's 7.5 barely registers as a gap in the science, while the difference in human outcome between the two events was almost total. Depth, soil conditions, and what was actually built above the epicenter end up mattering as much as the number itself, sometimes more. There's a piece of technology sitting underneath this entire comparison that deserves its own moment, because it's the clearest illustration of how much a few seconds of warning is actually worth. Earthquakes generate 2 types of seismic waves. The first, weaker wave, travels fast, and causes little damage on its own. The second, more violent wave travels slower, but carries the destructive shaking that collapses buildings. Early warning systems work by detecting that first, faster wave the instant a rupture begins, and pushing out an alert before the dangerous shaking arrives. Japan has run a nationwide version of this system since 2007, refining it continuously, integrating it into phones, public broadcasts, elevators, and high-speed rail lines that automatically begin braking the moment sensors detect unusual ground motion. That system is a meaningful part of why April's Sanriku earthquake produced 2 injuries instead of thousands. California's equivalent system, Shake Alert, is now active statewide and has already triggered alerts for smaller regional earthquakes, giving residents crucial seconds to drop, take cover, and get clear of anything that could fall. Venezuela had no comparable system in place. On June 24th, there was no alert, Millions of people in Caracas and La Guaira had no warning that the ground was about to move for the better part of a minute, until it already had. Which brings this back to the only question that actually matters for anyone watching this unfold from wherever they happen to live. The planet has been doing this for 4.5 billion years, long before anyone was around to name a magnitude scale, and it will keep doing it long after. Nobody can predict the exact day a locked fault finally gives way, in California, beneath Istanbul, or anywhere else carrying this kind of stored pressure. What varies, entirely, is what gets built above it in the meantime, and how seriously that risk gets treated while the ground is still quiet. The same week, Venezuela was still digging through rubble. A magnitude 6.5 earthquake shook the Philippines, tremors rattled Papua New Guinea, and a 5.2 registered in Nicaragua, none of them connected to the others, each one simply another data point along the ordinary restless background hum of a planet that never actually stops shaking, even when nobody outside the region is paying attention. Venezuela is still digging through what happens when that seriousness arrives decades too late. Japan just showed, again, what happens when it doesn't. And Southern California, sitting on a fault system that researchers now say has reached a stress level unmatched in 1,000 years, is the open question nobody currently has an answer to. Not how much time is left, only that the pressure underneath one of the most populated regions in North America is no longer building toward something. According to the people who study it for a living, it has already arrived,